Hello, and welcome to our first introductory lesson on SenseMaking. I'm Elizabeth Pastor, co-founder of Humantific in New York, a pioneering visual sense-making consulting company. Today, we are in our offices in Chelsea, in Manhattan, the booming art gallery district that has become quite popular with the High Line at our doorstep. The entire west side of New York City is transforming and will look quite different in the next few years. It's a great area with lots of creative energy. From here, we're working with corporations and nonprofits located in the city and many parts of the world. In our work, we combine visual sense making with change making. We work with all types of organizations, from large organizations such as Wells Fargo, Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, BBA, Vodafone, Telefonica, to small and medium businesses such as LiquidNet, Sermo, Pareto, to foundations and nonprofits such as the Gates Foundation, Ford Foundation, Heron Foundation, the BBC, Measure of America, and even cities like the city of Austin. The good thing about what we do is that in this complex, ever-changing world, everyone needs sense-making and change-making. In this module, we are focused on visual sense-making. Let's get started. So what is sense-making? What do we mean by this maybe mouthful of a word? Take a minute to think about it and write a few things down. Feel free to stop the video at any time and resume when you're ready. Let's deconstruct it. Sense-making, so that's like saying making sense of something if we change the order of the words. Funny how it's the same thing but can seem more complicated being one big word that is not often used. So making sense of something is a way of thinking, especially relevant when things are complex, because you need to sort them out. Other similar words are understanding, clarifying, organizing, untangling. When might this be useful? Think about your context. What are the types of situations, the challenges that come up that could use clarifying, organizing? Take a few minutes to write them down. And as we go through the video, I want you to connect back to them and think about how you might adapt them to your situation. We want this to be most relevant to you, okay? In the following story, Gary Van Patter, my fellow co-founder of Humantific, illustrates the positive impact of sense-making on his earlier career working in an architecture office.
Imagine a story that takes place before computers and before the internet. Might seem hard to imagine these days. Years ago, I was a young designer working in a large architectural firm. We were organized into teams around building design projects where the construction documents needed to be created over a period of several months. Typically, there were 25 architects working on one set of drawings for one complex building. Each set of construction documents consisted of hundreds of drawings. In those days, we made all the architectural drawings by hand using what was then called a cutting-edge system known as overlay drafting. Each drawing was made up of 5 layers of mylar, a plastic-like paper material. Each time an architect worked on a drawing, they had to retrieve all the related overlays, which were kept stacked in a central file. All the sheets looked the same in one big pile. Each architect had to go through the pile of layers one by one, looking in the corner of each drawing for the layers needed for that drawing. On each sheet, there was a small number in the bottom right-hand corner. Each architect would then take the layers back to their desk and work on them for several hours. When they were finished, each architect would return the layers back to the file and place them on top. Most of the architects just considered this procedure to be accepted routine. To me, this process seemed very tedious and time-consuming. Seeing that this process was wasting a lot of time for 25 expensive people, I stepped back and reflected on all the moving parts. I watched closely how the architects used and filed the drawing layers. I then came up with a simple color-coded system. I created drawing type categories and used simple colored stickers to mark each drawing type. This color-coded system overlaid the existing system of tiny numbers. I then made a color-coded key to the drawings and gave one to each architect. Now, with a color-coded sticker attached to each sheet, the architects could first look for the color instead of looking tediously for the right number among the entire stack of layers. When assembling their drawings, they could first look at the colors of layers and then look at the numbers. Upon completion, the architects returned the layers to color-coded piles. This small change revolutionized the drawing assembly process and significantly reduced the amount of time 25 architects were spending looking for the right drawings. It was a small thing, but certainly got noticed for its smarts. Soon after, I was asked to go sort out a much more complicated set of problems that was occurring far away on a building site in Saudi Arabia. At the time, I did not really know that I was a natural-born sense-maker, but discovered this some years later. When I look back on my career, I can see examples of this in numerous situations. Sense-making is what my brain tends to be good at and is useful in many different contexts that involve complexity.
That is a great intangible example of sense-making in everyday work situations. Let's hear Gary's take on the typical traits of sense-makers.
Sense-makers look for patterns in information, make connections among different things, synthesize lots of information and categorize it into small chunks. Think about the big picture and the why of a situation. Love to organize and untangle things.
Thank you. Ultimately, a passionate sense-maker is a curious person, always looking for opportunities to untangle situations, organize, and improve things. You might be thinking, if there are natural-born sense-makers, can you learn to be a sense-maker? My personal take on this is that there are natural-born sense-makers, just like there are natural-born artists, mathematicians, writers. They excel at it naturally. However, if we become aware of the traits of sense-makers and learn and practice them, we can definitely improve our sense-making capabilities. Are you ready? If you are, take a couple minutes now to write down 2 or 3 possible situations that you have encountered in the last month that could use some sense-making, clarifying, organizing, or untangling. Stop the video and write them down. Okay, now let's talk about the larger context of sense-making. Way back in 1996, Richard Saul Wurman, founder of the TED conferences, started to warn us of the tsunami of data that is crashing into the beaches of the civilized world. It's 2017, and the tsunami keeps rising. What do you think of that metaphor? I really like it because it feels very real. I feel it every day. There's more and more information around us, and in many different formats. Email, web, WhatsApp, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, even TV. Now, do you find that the massive amount of information we receive on a daily basis affects your ability to focus and concentrate? If you do find it makes it harder to focus and concentrate, you're not alone. Our attention span is declining. It has gone from 12 seconds to 8 seconds in just 4 years, according to the UK Telegraph. If you stop and think about it, that's a pretty big change in that time frame. We need sense-making, and that's why we're here today. The Institute for the Future, a US-based not-for-profit think tank based in Palo Alto, has identified sense-making as one of the top 10 key skills of the future that will be required across different jobs and work settings, given the mega-scale introduction of machines into the labor force. They define sense-making as the ability to determine the deeper meaning or significance of what is being expressed. Sense-making is a skill that helps us create unique insights, critical to decision-making, something that machines can't do. Before we get into the hows, I want to give you a 1-minute historical overview on sense-making, as it's a concept that's been around for a bit. William J.J. Gordon started studying and writing on sense-making in 1961. He talks about the difference between making something familiar, strange, such as marketing, and making something strange familiar, the latter being sense-making. Then Richard Wurman, who created the TED conferences, and I mentioned earlier, coined the term information architecture and made the focus of understanding an actual business. Brenda Durbin thought about it from a user-centered design perspective in the early digital realm. Carl Weick looked at it at an organizational level and thought about how workers and companies were sense-making in their everyday. Now at Humantific, we have built on many of our predecessors and brought it to the next level, adding the visual component to sense-making. Why do you think visualization might be important to sense making? Take a minute to think about it. Visuals often help us clarify things. In order to visualize something, we first have to make sense of it. So for me, they go hand in hand. In these 3 lessons on sense making, we will be talking about visual sense making, a super robust type of sense making. To give us an orientation to visual sense making and how visual sense makers think in more depth, I want to tell you a little bit about a community of practice with a long history and great visual sense making knowledge.